accepted as true that artists and scientists are different and think in different ways. And we think of scientists being rational, methodical, reductionist, rather serious kind of people, whereas artists are spontaneous, they're intuitive, they're holistic, all those things. And it's come to be sort of thought of as this idea of, two hemispheric brains. You've got the people who use the left-hand side of the brains, those are your sort of scientific types, and then you've got your artistic types who, use the right-hand side of the brain. Now, as generalizations go, generalizations are useful because they allow us in just a few words, oh, that person's, left-brained, to categorize, people, and there's some validity in that. But we have to recognize that it is also a rather lazy stereotype. And what I'm going to argue in the course of this lecture is the reality is actually significantly more complicated than that and much more interesting, that the way our brains work is much more integrated than that strict division. And I'm going to use examples from both the scientific community and the artistic community to try and illustrate that point. So let's start off with this engraving by Albrecht Dürer. It was not engraving, it's a watercolor, in fact, by Albrecht Dürer, which I think is a wonderful masterpiece of his genre, this incredible attention to detail. If you go and you look in there, given the time that it was painted, it's an amazing depiction of what he calls the large turf, the große Rasenstück. Okay. And what's interesting about this painting is not the painting itself, which is, as I say, a wonderful masterpiece in its own right, but the fact that it has become iconic in my field. So I'm an ecologist and a biodiversity specialist, and this particular image has become almost a totem in that community for representing the complexity and diversity of nature. And it was placed there in some ways by Charles Darwin. And in the last paragraph of his seminal work, The Origin of Species, actually talks about we should contemplate a tangled bank. Okay, his final sentence. And the question he's posing in that Origin of Species is basically, why is there so much diversity out there? We could do with much less. What is the purpose of all that diversity, and how did it come about? And he used this image of the tangled bank. And so subsequently, people who followed on from Charles Darwin, such as myself, have adopted this picture out of Albrecht Dürer, an artist who had no pretensions to be an ecologist. Ecology wasn't invented when he painted that. Neither was half of botany. But we've adopted that as an icon of the complexity of nature and its interrelationships. So back before there was photography, whenever you went on a scientific expedition, and just remember that during the 19th century, the big cutting edge of science was botany. It's hard to think of now. Now we think of particle physics and all sorts of things like that. But back in the 19th century, botany was where the action was at. If you aspired to be a scientist, you studied botany. Okay? And when you went on an expedition, you would always have an illustrator with you, because that was one of the only ways to bring back material. You could press it and send it back, that's fine, but it lost its color, it lost its natural morphology, it lost its context, the habitat that was in. So you took along an illustrator with you. And Charles Darwin, of course, really got his inspiration from this trip on the HMS Beagle, and that was an illustration by one of the painters who accompanied that expedition, just a little sketch that he did in Tierra del Fuego. Charles Darwin himself was not, in fact, any good as an artist. All right, he was greatly appreciative of this kind of art, and his great mentor at Cambridge University was, in fact, a botanical artist in his own right, as well as a leading botanist. But Charles Darwin, you can see, was a little bit more sketchy. But that little sketch there is his first inkling of evolution. That's the first record. This is a page out of his notebook, and you can see it says, "I think That was the aha moment, okay, when he first thought that in fact life is all related in this sort of tree-like structure, which is the foundation of how we think about evolution, cladistics, and ultimately the classification of organisms now is based on that idea. That was the moment he had that idea. And you can see he's representing it because it's fundamentally a relationship idea. He has to represent it spatially. You couldn't do that in words, okay? He has to do it with a picture, however childish the picture. So talking about naturalists and explorations, this is one of my, my heroes, a guy called Edward Wilson. He was the chief scientist on Scott's, disastrous final expedition to Antarctica. And, Edward Wilson was an amazing scientist, really. He was the scientific tour de force behind that expedition. Scott was the organizer and the great motivator and leader and whatnot, but Edward Wilson was the guy who did the science. And he was a naturalist and he covered many, many fields, but he was also a remarkable painter in his own right. And if you read Birdie Cherry Apsley's wonderful book about that expedition called The Worst Trip in the World. Okay, it's a stunning book. He describes, the conditions they were under were just phenomenal. And here was Edward Wilson trying to capture transient phenomena. He's got this whole series of paintings of the equivalent of boreal, lights, from and these sky things, at -20 in watercolors before the water froze. Okay, so the guy's nearly dead. He's got, frostbite all over, but he's trying to, paint and sketch these things. But he also, as was a naturalist, and he would make these little sketches in his notebook of things that he saw, and then he'd go back into the lab or wherever and actually produce these, final illustrations in his book. So an example of a guy who was, at the time, the top naturalist probably in the world, certainly in Britain, but also, in fact, in his own right, a really perceptive and fine artist. Of course, we have echoes of this in our own South African history. The first sort of explorations by Europeans into the interior of the country were always accompanied and often led by artists. Thomas Baines is a great example. He wasn't primarily a scientist, but he made observations and depicted things in ways that we find scientifically very useful now. So this particular painting of that particular baobab still exists, okay? It's in the Machari, it's a little cluster of baobabs known as Baines baobab. He actually carved his name on them. And we can go back and see these paintings and say, yes, that one's still there, that one's still there, that one's fallen down. Therefore, the mean lifespan of baobabs, must be about this. So, unintentional consequence. We also have people like this. So this was a young gentlewoman called Katherine, I don't remember what her maiden name was, but she received, you can see, well, her date of birth, I think, was early part of the 19th century, and she would have got what a gentlewoman's education was in those days, which was a little bit of painting. You had to be able to, do it, dash off a watercolor. She might have even had a little bit of botany, okay, because that was what you taught. And then she got married quite young to Mr. Saunders and came out to South Africa. And he was the pioneer of the sugar industry in South Africa and founded what then became, Ilovo and Tongaat. They lived at Tongaat. This was 1856, okay? You can imagine, these were some of the first settlers in the country living out there, kind of really in the bush, surrounded by all this flora, which no one had ever documented before. Much of it was undescribed, and she started painting. And what happened was that she moved from being a simple painter of flowers into being one of the foremost experts of the flora of the area, because she got into correspondence with the top botanists at the time. So she was in regular correspondence, for instance, with Hooker at Kew. And you can see in her paintings, not only they're very attractive, but she starts including these kind of details. And that's one of the ways that you sort of separate painters of flowers, okay, from botanical illustrators, because botanical illustrators is usually trying to make some kind of point, okay? They're trying to illustrate something which is important about the taxonomy of the plant. And one of the key things is how many stamens and what's their arrangement. And so that's why you get those little sections. And by convention in botanical illustration, those are done in pencil, okay, along the side, along with the notes.